For decades, Paul Newman was more than just a movie star. He was Hollywood's moral compass. With his piercing blue eyes, disarming charm, and quiet strength, he embodied the very essence of the golden age of film. But behind the lights and the glamour, Newman saw something most audiences never could: a world of secrecy, sacrifice, and silent suffering. In the golden glow of 1950s and 60s Hollywood, where image meant everything, being different could destroy a career overnight. Studio contracts controlled not only what actors said, but who they loved. Many stars were forced to hide their true selves, their identities buried beneath fabricated romances and press-manufactured marriages. Newman, who spent his entire career defying Hollywood's shallow expectations, carried their stories with him. Near the end of his life, as age stripped away the fear of consequence, he finally opened up, revealing names and memories of stars whose truth had been erased by time. They were legends, men and women whose films shaped generations. Yet they lived in constant fear that the world would turn on them for who they really were. Newman's words were not gossip. They were confessions of empathy, an attempt to give back the dignity that decades of silence had stolen. This is not a story about scandal. It's a story about courage, the unseen battle of Hollywood's brightest lights, and one man's final act of honesty before the curtain fell for good. Hollywood's golden age, the era of elegance, charm, and illusion. It was a time when movie studios were kingdoms, and actors were their carefully sculpted royalty. On the surface, everything sparkled: red carpets, flashbulbs, and love stories that seemed tailor-made for the silver screen. But behind the perfect smiles and glossy publicity shots lay a world built on secrecy and fear. When Paul Newman first stepped into this world in the early 1950s, he quickly learned that success came with rules, and silence was one of them. The major studios controlled every aspect of a star's public life. They dictated what they wore, who they dated, and how they behaved. A single rumor could destroy a career. And for actors or actresses who identified as gay or bisexual, the stakes were life-shattering. Newman, a man of empathy and integrity, observed this painful double life firsthand. "I saw people terrified of themselves," he once said quietly to a friend. They were taught to act on screen, but off-screen they were acting just to survive. He wasn't exaggerating. Publicists invented fake romances, pairing gay actors with actresses for staged dates to create the illusion of heterosexual perfection. Tabloid journalists were bribed to stay silent or threatened to keep secrets buried. Agents warned their clients to never, ever speak about certain feelings. Even whispers could ruin everything. Among Newman's peers were countless talented performers who bore this hidden burden. Some would later be quietly outed in memoirs or rumors. Others took their truth to the grave. Newman never revealed names in public at the time, not out of fear, but respect. "It's not my secret to tell," he once remarked. But as he grew older, that line between silence and justice began to blur. He had seen too much, too many careers destroyed, too many lives lived in pain. One of his close friends, a fellow actor, confided to him that the loneliness of hiding was worse than any professional rejection. "I can't even love in peace," the man had said, "because the world won't let me." That moment haunted Newman for decades. In interviews late in his life, Newman spoke cryptically about this invisible group of heroes, men and women who had shaped Hollywood but never received their due because of who they were. They gave everything to the craft, he said, but had to erase themselves in the process. As the 1970s and 80s arrived, the culture began to shift slowly. A few brave actors began hinting at their truth, though the industry's fear remained deep-rooted. Newman, now one of Hollywood's most respected figures, used his growing influence to quietly support them. He donated anonymously to LGBTQ+ charities and spoke privately about the need for compassion and acceptance in Hollywood. But it wasn't until his later years that he finally began to speak openly, not to expose or sensationalize, but to honor. He believed these hidden stars deserved to be remembered for both their courage and their artistry. In those twilight years, as his health declined and reflection took over, Newman began revealing stories, not to the press, but to trusted friends and biographers. Stories of love that had to be hidden. Stories of actors who risked everything for a glimpse of authenticity. Stories of pain buried beneath fame. Hollywood had always been built on illusion, but Newman wanted truth to have its moment in the light, even if it came decades too late. And with that decision, he set in motion the quiet unraveling of one of Hollywood's best-kept secrets. Paul Newman often said that Hollywood was a beautiful prison. To outsiders, it was the land of dreams, where talent, beauty, and charisma could make anyone a star. But to those inside, it was a machine that demanded masks. Behind the dazzling lights of the Golden Age, there existed a silent network of actors and actresses who lived double lives, forced into secrecy by fear of exposure. Newman was young when he began to notice the cracks in the system. At parties, he'd see actors whisper in corners, their words half hidden by the noise of champagne glasses. Some would arrive with studio-assigned dates, while their true partners remained in the shadows. He didn't need anyone to explain what was happening. He could feel the tension in the air, the quiet heartbreak of people who could never be fully themselves. He once recalled seeing a famous actor, whose name he never revealed publicly, sitting alone on a movie set after filming a romantic scene. The man looked utterly broken. When Newman approached, the actor smiled and said, "They pay me to pretend to be in love. But when I actually am, it could destroy me." That moment stayed with Newman for life. During the 1950s, being labeled gay could end a career overnight. Studio executives treated it like a disease, something to be contained and denied. Some actors were sent to conversion therapy. Others were pressured into sham marriages to protect their image. The public never suspected, because the studios were masters at deception. Publicists planted love stories in magazines, arranged photo shoots of couples, and crafted narratives of passionate romances that never truly existed. Newman later said, "We all acted even when the cameras weren't rolling. It wasn't art, it was survival." He wasn't alone in his sympathy. A few trusted peers, like Marlon Brando and Elizabeth Taylor, shared his compassion and quietly offered support to those struggling with identity. Brando himself once said, "Like everyone else, I've had experiences with men, but no one dares talk about it." It was a whisper in the dark, one that only a few dared to echo. Newman's friendship circle included several actors who confided their secrets to him. Knowing he would never judge, he carried those confessions carefully, guarding them as if they were sacred. Over time, he became a kind of emotional refuge, someone safe in a world that wasn't. One actress, whose name Newman never revealed but described as one of the greatest leading ladies of her time, confided that she loved another woman deeply, yet could never show it. "We went to the movies like strangers," she told him once. "But behind closed doors, she was my world." Newman, deeply moved, later said it was the most tragic love story he'd ever witnessed, not because it ended, but because it could never begin in the open. As his fame grew, Newman began using his influence subtly. He encouraged more natural performances, ones that reflected truth rather than perfection. He pushed back against scripts that treated difference as weakness. "Art should liberate," he once said, "not imprison." Still, he kept the stories of those he loved locked away, waiting for a time when the world would be ready to hear them. By the 1990s, that time was drawing closer. Society was changing, slowly but surely. Newman, older and wiser, felt an urgency growing in his heart. He knew his generation's secrets would soon vanish with them. And before his own curtain fell, he was determined to ensure that their courage, their quiet, heartbreaking authenticity would not be forgotten. By the early 2000s, Paul Newman had already achieved everything: Oscars, humanitarian awards, and a legacy as one of Hollywood's most respected figures. But behind that calm, dignified exterior was a man haunted by the ghosts of the past. He had spent decades guarding the secrets of friends who'd lived in fear, and as he grew older, the weight of those secrets began to feel unbearable. Newman had always been loyal, sometimes to a fault. He believed that people deserved to tell their own stories. But as many of his old friends passed away, he began to realize that silence was no longer a form of protection. It had become a kind of erasure. These people, these artists, had given their lives to cinema, and yet their truth had been buried beneath studio lies. Newman knew it was time to speak, carefully, respectfully, but honestly. It started in quiet interviews and private conversations. A few journalists who knew Newman personally described moments where he would drift into memory, not to sensationalize, but to honor. "People think Hollywood was glamorous," he once told a biographer. "They don't know how much pain was hiding under all that glitter." He began by acknowledging what many had whispered about for years: that some of the most beloved stars of Hollywood's golden age had lived under false identities, forced into silence about who they loved. Newman reportedly mentioned several names, never in malice, but in deep compassion. He spoke of Montgomery Clift, whose tortured genius reflected a man torn between his art and his inner truth. "He was so gentle," Newman said, "and so afraid. He never got to just be." He talked of Rock Hudson, the matinee idol whose secret was both an open mystery and a guarded tragedy. Newman called him a good man trapped in a cruel time. He remembered visiting him near the end of his life during Hudson's AIDS battle. "He didn't need pity," Newman said softly. "He needed understanding and love." He also reflected on others who were rarely discussed: women who lived in quiet partnerships disguised as roommates, actors who never married but kept a smile for the cameras. In private, they found solace in small moments: handwritten notes, secret meetings, gestures of affection hidden behind stage doors. Newman called them the bravest people I ever knew. During one of his final in-depth interviews, Newman reportedly said something that would echo long after his passing: "If truth is what makes us human, then Hollywood tried to take humanity away from them. I just want their truth to live, even if they didn't get to." For Newman, it wasn't about outing anyone. It was about reclaiming dignity for those who'd been silenced by fear and control. He wanted people to understand that behind every glamorous smile was a human being who had loved, lost, and longed for freedom just like anyone else. Friends who were close to him said that these conversations often left Newman emotional. He'd go quiet for minutes, one recalled. You could see he was reliving things, moments where he wished he could have done more. In his later years, Newman also made a symbolic gesture, donating to charities that supported LGBTQ+ youth in the arts. He said it was his way of paying forward what others never had. He couldn't rewrite history, but he could ensure that the truth wouldn't die in silence. And in that quiet defiance, in those final, heartfelt confessions, Paul Newman gave a voice back to the forgotten souls of Hollywood's golden age. When Paul Newman passed away in 2008, Hollywood mourned the loss of one of its last true gentlemen, an actor who carried integrity like armor in an industry that often traded in illusion. But what the public didn't fully understand then was that Newman had left behind more than just classic films and philanthropy. He had left behind truth, quiet revelations that would change how the world remembered Hollywood's golden age. In the years following his death, fragments of Newman's final conversations began to surface. Biographers, close friends, and journalists who had known him personally shared stories of his reflections, the names he had spoken with such tenderness, the regret he carried for the people who had lived and died in silence. He hadn't revealed secrets to expose anyone. He had done it to restore their humanity, to remind the world that these stars were not defined by the lies that Hollywood forced upon them, but by their courage to live and love, even when it meant doing so in the shadows. Historians began to re-examine the lives of certain stars through a new lens. Montgomery Clift, once seen only as a tragic genius, was now understood as a man who had carried immense emotional weight, trying to balance identity and art. Rock Hudson's story became more than a tabloid headline. It became a symbol of both suffering and resilience. The names Newman had uttered with respect began to be spoken by others, not in whispers but with pride. One journalist wrote, "Newman didn't out anyone. He gave them back to history, As new generations of filmmakers, actors, and fans learned about these hidden lives, Hollywood's narrative began to shift. The conversation around authenticity and identity grew louder. By the 2010s, films and documentaries about queer icons of the past were finally being made, projects that Newman's honesty had quietly inspired. His influence extended far beyond acting. It helped humanize an entire generation that had been forgotten behind studio walls. His family later revealed that Newman had written a series of private letters before his passing, not to the public, but to those he admired or their surviving families. In them, he expressed gratitude for their artistry and sorrow for their suffering. One letter reportedly read, "I don't tell these stories for attention. I tell them because silence was the crime. They were artists who deserved love as freely as applause." That line became the opening quote of a major retrospective film festival dedicated to LGBTQ+ figures of classic Hollywood. The festival, held in Los Angeles years after his death, honored Newman posthumously as a friend of truth. For those who knew him, this legacy came as no surprise. Throughout his life, Newman had always chosen compassion over conformity. Whether it was standing up against racial injustice, supporting equality, or quietly defending the marginalized, he had always believed that art should reflect honesty. "Without truth," he once said, "film is just shadows on a wall." In the final years of his life, Paul Newman understood something most in Hollywood never would, that fame fades, awards gather dust, but the truth endures. The actors he had spoken about, those who lived unseen, who loved in fear, who died without ever hearing acceptance, were finally being remembered not for what they hid, but for what they gave the world. And as the reel of history continues to turn, Newman's voice lingers like a final line of dialogue that refuses to fade.